They didn't know his name. Not when the parade halted mid-stride. Not when 47 Marines in full dress blues turned, as if pulled by something deeper than command, to face the old man sitting motionless at the edge of the street. Not even when the commanding officer stepped away from the formation, crossed the sunlit pavement alone, and raised his hand in salute. But when the old man returned it, slowly, painfully, fingers trembling like dried leaves in a breeze, you could feel the silence ripple down Main Street like a wave. You could feel the air tighten in your lungs, and that's when people began to cry. My son tugged at my hand, his voice a whisper that sliced right through me. "Mom, who is he?" I couldn't answer then, but I can now, because he lived next to us for 5 years. In the White House with the rusted porch rail, the peeling paint that curled like old photographs, and a front yard no one stepped into unless their soccer ball went too far. The birds always came to feed there. The wind chimes always swayed, even when there was no wind, and the porch light was always on, even in the middle of the day. His name was Calvin Stone, but I didn't know that, not until the day he knocked on my door. It was the day before Memorial Day. I remember because I had just been yelling at my son for trying to microwave a fork, and the sun was beginning to sink into that soft, honey-colored angle it only takes in late spring. 3 knocks. Slow. I wiped my hands on a dish towel, opened the door, and there he was, straighter than usual, his hand gripping a folded American flag like it was something sacred. He looked up at me with eyes the color of worn oak. "Would you take me to the parade tomorrow?" he asked. That was it. No hello, no small talk, no smile. Just that one question, delivered not like a request, but like a final will. I nodded. What else could I do? He nodded back once, handed me the flag, and walked away without another word. I stood in the doorway long after he'd disappeared, that soft triangle of fabric warming in my hands. That night, I left it on the table. It seemed wrong to fold it again. I watched it in the lamplight, the threads just beginning to fray. There was weight in it. Not the cloth itself, but the years it had survived. The hands it had passed through. The eyes that had looked at it before me. I should have asked him questions, but I didn't. Something in his voice, in the silence between his words, told me not to. The next morning, before even the birds had started their songs, he was ready. He was standing on his porch when I pulled into the driveway, already dressed in his Marine uniform. It didn't fit the way it must have once. The coat sagged in the shoulders. The sleeves reached a bit too far past the wrist, but every crease was sharp. Every button shined. He didn't smile when I stepped out, just nodded again. I watched as he locked his front door, slowly, like he was saying goodbye, not to the house, but to the man he'd been in it. He walked to the car without assistance, though every step seemed to cost him something. My son, already in the back seat, leaned forward to look at him through the headrest. For once, he didn't say a word. We drove in silence. Brookhaven was alive with color that morning. Flags lined every lamppost. Children ran ahead of their parents with pinwheels and plastic horns. Lawn chairs bloomed on the sidewalks like wildflowers. But when we reached the edge of the parade route, Calvin asked me to stop. "Here," he said softly. "This is far enough." It was a spot most people passed without noticing, where the parade curves before heading back toward the square. The crowds didn't linger there. No speakers, no grandstand, just shade from the sycamores and the occasional gust of warm wind. I helped him into his wheelchair. He sat slowly, not because his body was weak, but because he treated the motion like ritual, like lowering himself onto sacred ground. As I adjusted his coat, I noticed something in the breast pocket. A photograph, faded nearly to sepia, the edges curled and soft. 2 young Marines, uniforms soaked in mud, one of them grinning with an arm thrown over a shoulder just outside the frame. The other, only partially visible. But something about the eyes, sharp, steady, looked familiar. Calvin didn't notice me looking. Or maybe he did, and chose not to stop me. The photo told me more than he ever had. We waited. The first strains of music came at noon, sharp and off-key. The high school band, followed by fire trucks, veterans on motorcycles, floats held together with duct tape and pride. People cheered, children shouted. Confetti floated like ash through the air. But no one looked at Calvin. He sat perfectly still, one hand resting lightly on the folded flag in his lap. Every so often, he glanced at the sky. Not like someone looking for weather. More like someone waiting for a signal. More like someone remembering the exact shade of blue it had been when everything changed. The sound came before we saw them. Boots. Not stomping, not clattering, but rhythmic. Measured. Like thunder with a purpose. The crowd shifted, instinctively turning their heads. Cell phones lifted. Flags fluttered from little hands. 47 Marines emerged from the far end of Main Street, their dress blues gleaming in the noon sun. They moved like one body. Eyes forward, jaws locked, medals catching the light as they marched. And at the front, him. A tall man with steel-gray hair and shoulders that looked carved from the same discipline that held the others in line. His eyes scanned the crowd, not idly, not politely, but like a man searching for something specific, something he wasn't sure he'd find. Then he stopped. Mid-step. It was like the world skipped a beat. He raised one hand, high, sharp, final, and the entire formation halted behind him. The band faltered. Someone dropped a soda. Murmurs rose like a breeze between buildings. A child asked why the music stopped, but I already knew something was about to happen. I could feel it in my chest, like a storm was pressing down. The officer walked, alone, across the street. His boots made no sound I could hear, but they echoed in Calvin's posture, which straightened not with pride, but with inevitability. His hands, resting on the flag, curled slightly, like they recognized this moment, had rehearsed it in silence 1,000 times. The officer stopped in front of him, removed his hat, and with a voice that did not tremble said, "Staff Sergeant Calvin D. Stone, you are not forgotten." The wind stopped. The sun felt hotter. Calvin didn't speak. He didn't need to. His eyes, lined with age and unshed memory, lifted to meet the younger man's, and in that space between them, something vast passed, something the rest of us could only feel, but not touch. The officer turned to the crowd. "Most of you don't know this man," he said, "but I would not be standing here if not for him." His voice was clear, strong, but there was grief hiding beneath the edges. In 1951, during the Korean War, my father, Lieutenant Marcus Ellison, was ambushed. 2 bullets, no cover, no chance. Every man around him had fallen back. He turned back to Calvin. Except one. He paused as if giving the silence its due. One Marine ran toward the gunfire, dragged my father to safety, carried another wounded man on his back nearly 400 yards. He should have died that day, but he didn't. He faced the crowd again. That Marine was Sergeant Stone. He filed no report. He accepted no medal. He came home, moved to this town, and lived quietly, as if he had not saved a life, as if he had not saved a family. I felt tears press forward, uninvited. My son gripped my arm, eyes wide. The officer continued, "But we never forgot. And every year since I took command, my platoon has marched under a name my father spoke with reverence. Stone Platoon." Gasps. Someone dropped a phone. Someone else whispered, "Oh my God." But I just stared at Calvin. He wasn't crying. He looked lighter, like a weight he'd carried alone for a lifetime had suddenly shifted off his shoulders and into the hands of 47 others. The officer stepped aside, and one by one, the Marines behind him began to move. Each walked forward. Each stopped before Calvin's wheelchair. Each saluted. Each said, "Thank you, Sergeant." Not loudly, not theatrically, but with a sincerity that made it feel like the street might split open from the pressure of so much unspoken reverence. 47 times. Calvin's lips parted once. He tried to speak. I saw it, but no words came. Only the trembling of his hand as he slowly raised it in return, palm stiff, salute clean, despite the decades. The crowd behind us didn't cheer. They couldn't. The kind of silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was sacred. A woman across the street began to cry. A man behind me lowered his cap to his chest. The children didn't ask questions now. Even they seemed to know. Something holy had just happened in front of them. And when the final Marine stepped back into formation, the officer nodded again. They turned and marched on. No music resumed. No voices rose. Because once a moment like that passes through you, your throat forgets how to make noise. Calvin didn't move for a long time after they were gone. His hand dropped gently back to his lap, fingers still curled from the salute. His gaze remained fixed on the space where the last Marine had stood, as if his eyes hadn't caught up with the truth of it yet. I crouched beside him, unsure whether to speak. Then I saw it, just a flicker. His mouth opened the slightest bit and he breathed. Not a sigh, not a gasp, just breath. Like someone who had been underwater for too long, surfacing not for air, but for clarity. He whispered something. I leaned in. Luis saw it. 3 words. That was all. I didn't know who Luis was, not then, but the way he said it, like it mattered more than the medals he never accepted, more than the salutes, like he hadn't needed any of it, except maybe that moment, where he believed someone who never made it home had just witnessed everything from above. We didn't speak on the way home, not because there was nothing to say, but because the silence felt full now, like it was doing its own remembering. Calvin stared out the window, one hand resting on the photograph again. He didn't look back at the parade. He looked up, at the sky, at something only he could see. When we pulled into his driveway, he didn't wait for help. He moved slowly, carefully, up the ramp I hadn't noticed had been repaired. At the door, he paused. The light flicked on above him, though the sun hadn't fully set. "Thank you," he said. It was the first time I'd ever heard warmth in his voice. And something else, too. Release. I opened my mouth to answer, but he'd already stepped inside. That was the last time I saw him alive. And the next morning, his porch light was still on. It was still on at noon, and still on when the mail came and went without being touched. At dusk, something pulled me across the lawn, a quiet urgency, the kind that tells you things before you're ready to know them. The door was unlocked. Inside, everything was in place. Uniform hung carefully, shoes aligned, flag folded atop the dresser like a final exhale, and Calvin Stone was lying in his bed, one hand resting gently over his chest, The other still curved around the photo he'd carried the day before. His expression was still, not peaceful in a cliché way. Still like the surface of a lake that once held a storm and now reflects only sky. I sat with him for a long while. Hours, maybe. I didn't cry at first, not until I saw the envelope, addressed in handwriting that looked like it had been practiced for years and only used once. It was for me. Inside was a note, barely a paragraph. Claire, thank you for driving an old ghost to the edge of the world one last time. Tell your boy to keep the flag, and tell him not all heroes come home in uniforms. Some just come home in silence. Don't leave the porch light on for me, but maybe leave it on for someone else. C. Stone, I stayed up all night after that. I couldn't bring myself to turn the light off, and I didn't have to, because sometime around midnight someone else lit a candle on their porch, then another, and another. By morning, our entire street glowed with little flames. No signs, no speeches, just warmth pushing back the dark. It started with us, but it didn't end here. By the end of the week, Calvin's story had traveled further than he ever did. Someone had filmed the salute, posted it online. The video didn't go viral because of an algorithm. It went viral because truth does that. Especially the quiet kind. The kind you almost miss if you're not looking closely enough. Letters came from across the country, from veterans who'd never met him but swore they knew someone just like him. From families who wanted to say thank you. From children who asked if they could lower their flags for him, even if they didn't know how. One mother drove 7 hours to leave a folded paper crane on his porch. She said it was for all the invisible men who carried nations on their backs. His funeral was held at the smallest chapel in town. It didn't matter. People filled the pews, then the aisles, then the steps. Some stood in the street, holding hands or holding flags. Most didn't speak. Because grief, when it's rooted in reverence, knows better than to make noise. The mayor gave a short speech, generic, polite, but it was Colonel Ellison, Marcus's son, who stood last. He approached the altar in full dress blues, not for ceremony, for promise. He never asked for this, he said. Never wanted it. He looked out over the crowd, no notes in his hand, just the photo, now restored and framed. But a man like Calvin Stone doesn't belong in silence forever. He held up the picture. This was taken the day he carried my father out of hell. He never spoke of it. Never mentioned his friend, Luis, who didn't make it back, but my family remembered. His voice wavered, not from weakness, but from carrying something too heavy, too long. He saved my father. He served his country. But more than that, he showed us what it means to live with dignity after the noise is gone. Then he looked at me. Claire, you gave him back to us. And suddenly, I couldn't see clearly anymore. After the funeral, no one rushed to leave. People lingered outside the chapel, not out of obligation, but because they didn't know how to return to a world that had, only a day ago, overlooked a man like Calvin Stone. The wind was soft that afternoon, as if the sky itself had exhaled. Leaves rustled in the gutters. Flags moved in unison without anyone touching them. And then, from down the road, they came again. The 47 Stone platoon. No fanfare, no drumbeat, just boots against asphalt, measured, reverent, deliberate. They marched past the chapel, past the post office, past the diner with the crooked blinds, and the corner where Calvin used to pause before crossing the street. They marched until they reached his home, and then, in perfect formation, they stopped. Each man removed his hat. No one said a word. There were no orders barked, no horns blown. Just the wind brushing softly against the brass on their uniforms and the creak of old porch wood under the weight of memory. Each Marine, one after another, raised his hand in final salute. Not to a commanding officer, not to a symbol, but to a man. A man who had chosen silence over ceremony, service over spotlight. A man who had carried something heavier than medals and never asked to put it down. The final Marine, a younger one, perhaps barely old enough to have known war, stepped forward last. He didn't salute immediately. He stood there, eyes locked on the house, and whispered, "Semper Fi, Sergeant." Then his hand rose, and it stayed there longer than the others, as if trying to make up for the decades the world had looked away. That night, the porch light at Calvin's house remained on. So did ours, and the Fergusons next door, and the Pattersons across the street. And one by one, porch by porch, house by house, the entire block became a constellation of quiet gratitude. No one organized it. No one asked. It just happened. Because sometimes when something holy passes through a town, it leaves behind an echo. Not loud, but lasting. I still think about him when I hear the national anthem and watch people stand, not out of habit, but out of memory. When my son lowers our flag every evening without being told. When I catch myself looking at an old man on a park bench and wondering if he too once carried a brother through fire and never spoke of it. Calvin taught me that there are people who will never tell their stories, and that sometimes it's not because they've forgotten, but because remembering costs them something. He taught me that not all heroes come home with bands playing. Some come home with ghosts that follow them to the grocery store, to the backyard, to the chair they sit in at every parade they never join. He taught me that silence isn't absence. Sometimes it's sacrifice. Sometimes it's love so deep it forgets how to speak. If you've listened this far, thank you. Thank you for giving your time to a man who never asked for it. Thank you for remembering someone the world nearly forgot. I hope the next time you see someone sitting quietly, not asking for much, you wonder what they're holding, what they've carried, and who they once were. Because the truth is, there are Calvins everywhere, waiting for someone to see them, waiting for a world that moves too fast to pause long enough to remember. And maybe now, just maybe, you'll be the one to stop, to ask, to listen. Because behind every silent salute, there might be a life that changed the world.